So good evening. It's a pleasure to be with you here at the Traces lecture series, Wörterbuch des Ausstellens. And it's my pleasure to introduce our next guest to the Traces lecture series, Robert Jan van Pelt. He's the best-known international expert on the history of the construction of the Auschwitz concentration camp and the author of the book, The Case for Auschwitz, Evidence from Irving Trial, published in 2002 with Indiana University Press. He's also the author of the book, The Evidence Room, published in 2016 with New Jewish Press. The Evidence Room is a critical study of the role architecture played in constructing Auschwitz and is both a companion piece to eyesight and an elaboration of an exhibit at the 2016 Venice Architecture Biennale based on Van Pelt's authoritative testimony against Holocaust denial in a 2000 libel suit argued before the Royal Courts of Justice in London. His research has been published in numerous languages. He developed a strategy for the development of the UNESCO World Heritage Site there, was a key witness in the trial against the Holocaust denier David Irving, and as a result, developed the methodology of forensic architectural research. He has been visiting professor at the architecture faculty at the University of Kassel this fall term. Recently, he dealt with the global history of the wooden barracks, as well as with the conception of the Jewish space. He's architectural advisor to the Babin Yar Holocaust Memorial Center and professor of architectural history at Waterloo University, Canada. Myself, I'm Liliana Gómez, a newly appointed professor for art and society at the University of Kassel and at the newly founded Documenta Institute. Robert, it's a pleasure to have you with us here in this lecture series.
Yeah, Liliana, I'm very sorry that we can't actually be together in the same space. I had to return to Canada early because of the worsening situation. So I'm now in Toronto, but I know the building quite well. The building that was the Hilbersheimer's little home that was created by the University of Kassel team. And I think you're very lucky to have such a wonderful building as a center of all of your lectures. I do think that you're also not in the building right now, looking at your background. But am I ready to go? I've prepared a short introduction to the evidence room. So if you allow me, I would like to take over and show it. I understand we have a conversation after that. So yes, here should be my slides. And right now you should see, I'm going to do play. I hope that you see my my opening slide, which is the title, The Evidence Room, an Exercise in Forensic Architecture. Just to slightly modify what you said, the whole concept of forensic architecture really is A.L. Weizmann's, and I think that whenever we're talking about the forensic interpretation of architecture, certainly his contribution has been absolutely vital. It just happened that I, on a parallel track, also made some contribution in relationship to the Auschwitz, the use of Auschwitz as a center of genocide. So I just would like to create a very quick context of where we are, as one can see from the popularity of television series like CSI, Crime Scene Investigation in the United States and elsewhere. Forensic research has become very popular these days. And one of the reasons is, of course, that it combines two things. First of all, science, the adventure of scientific investigation, but also a moral urgency. That is that the scientific investigation always takes place in the context of a crime and in the desire to solve the crime and bring the bad person to justice and get a conviction. And that, of course, is quite a engaging kind of mix for the entertainment industry. Just to go over again a very basic meaning of the word forensic. In English, it goes back to the Latin forensis, which means to pertain to the forum. The forum in Roman times, which was the court of law. So it deals with evidence that is going to be presented in a court of law. And that's, I think, very important, that ultimately this idea that it needs to be presented, it's going to be tested in a court, is essential to the idea of a forensic investigation. So if we're looking at the history of forensics, traditionally, it is considered to have started in the mid-13th century in China with the publication of the collected cases of injustice rectified by Shang-Chi. And today also there are many television series about this character, where we see him solving crimes in the 13th century, very popular in today's China and Hong Kong. In the West, the first time that we got a kind of more theoretical consideration of the potential of forensics, that means of some scientific research in solving crimes, which normally, of course, always relies on the testimony by witnesses, dates from the mid-16th century, and it's Ambroise Paré who publishes a book on it and introduces the idea of, in some way, material evidence in a court. It becomes much more comprehensive as a theory in the early 19th century, and this has also to do with the establishment of the first professional police force, the modern professional police force, first in France and then in England. And so here we have the treatise on legal medicine by Monsieur Fauderay. And then in the mid-19th century, for the first time, forensic evidence is being introduced in courtrooms in England. And a central character is there, James Marsh, who is involved in a trial where ultimately someone has been poisoned, and his task is to prove the residue of poison of arsenic in this case, in a poison that the poisoner, the alleged criminal, would have used. And he then devises also a test for the first time, a scientific test, to prove the presence of arsenic. A decade later, Sir William Herschel, well known, of course, as an astronomer, then develops basically fingerprinting, and this becomes, in some way, this popularizes for the first time the forensic investigation, and also captures, of course, the imagination, because fingerprinting is done prophylactically, in a sense. People can be fingerprinted before the crime, especially, of course, also when people are arrested. And so this starts to, in some way, now engage much larger groups of the population. In literature, it is Arthur Conan Doyle in his stories about Sherlock Holmes, who in some way creates a rather kind of comprehensive picture of what at that time still is very much only the potential of forensic investigation. Certainly what Sherlock Holmes is able to pull off in his lab or in his living room, for that matter, was still beyond the actual forensic capacities of the time. By the beginning of the 20th century, we got the first forensic labs, in this case in Lausanne, in Switzerland. And by the 1920s, police forces are also going to be equipped with standard forensic procedures for the first time, and also, as we see here in this case, standard kits that can be brought to the crime scene to collect evidence. It is only really that with the advent of DNA profiling in the 1980s that the alleged potential, the assumed potential of forensic sign really becomes now, is going to be realized. In some way, it's going to be now a very important tool in the courtroom. Now, of course, ballistic tests and so on have already been used before, but it's really DNA profiling that can bring in some way link a particular piece of evidence with a particular agent. It's also in the 1980s that for the first time, forensic investigation of architecture becomes news. In 1988, an American engineer who has a small business to certify execution equipment. In the United States, executions, of course, are legal, but before an execution, the equipment needs to be certified to be quote unquote safe, that is for the executioner. This man, Fred Leuchter, an engineer from Malden, Massachusetts, had developed a small business to basically certify execution equipment, which at that time included also gas chambers in the states of Missouri and Maryland. And he was hired by a Holocaust denier as part of a law case to basically collect evidence in Auschwitz. So, which brings me back to the actual investigations that were done in 1945 in Auschwitz. So Auschwitz is a camp in which over 1.3 million people were deported to. 1.1 million, almost all Jews, were murdered there, mostly in cyanide gas chambers. And after the liberation of Auschwitz in January 1945, two teams of forensic experts basically investigated the site, interviewed survivors. The most important one was the second team led by Judge Jan Steen, who was a juge d'instruction, an investigating judge in Krakow, and Professor Dawidowski. So we see Jan Steen right in the center of this picture with a striped tie, and Professor Dawidowski, who's a professor of engineering and architecture, with the Basque beret on the right side. And here they are at the ruined entry into the undressing room of crematorium number 2. And because in Auschwitz, the tools of murder had included, importantly so, buildings that had been designed for that purpose, in some way, the forensic investigation at the site itself had to also engage with the ruins of the buildings, with surviving blueprints, and of course with testimony about their use. And so this was this forensic investigation, which also had many other aspects, had an architectural component to it at the time. And so this is a drawing that was produced in May 1945 by a draftsman of this team that shows the arrangement in crematorium number 2 of the killing part. You have a undressing room to the left, originally a morgue with an entry there. You have a gas chamber to the right, and then on the main floor there are 15 ovens, of which 9 are visible, with a total incineration capacity in the single building of around 1,450 corpses per day. The conclusions of the committee that was headed by Jan Steen and Professor Dawidowski remained unchallenged until the late 1980s. What happened at that time was that a German citizen who was a permanent resident of Canada, named Ernst Zundel, was put on trial. There were in fact 2 trials, but I'm focusing now on the second trial. Zundel, because of the kind of freedom of speech, the absolute freedom of speech that exists in Canada, and which in relationship to Holocaust denial did not exist in Germany, had used this kind of a Canadian freedom to establish a publishing house in Canada that focused on Holocaust denial. He was very theatrical in the way that he also presented his views. We see him here with a helmet of a construction worker. He always would go to meetings with these helmets, claiming, of course, that he was in some way going to clean the reputation of Germany, the wartime reputation. Quite often he would be dressed in a concentration camp uniform to basically say that the Germans were the real victims of the Holocaust, that the Holocaust was a hoax created by the English first and later the Jews to shackle basically the Germans in some kind of moral prison. And he was on trial in Canada for spreading false news. That is a law that comes from the 18th century. And what is remarkable about this trial is that one of the witnesses that was willing to testify on behalf of Zundel was David Irving, who was a man who had already written some 10 to 15 histories of the Second World War. He was not a trained historian, but a very well-known writer of historical books on Nazism and so on, had many contacts with old Nazis. And basically he endorsed Leuchter's testimony. Leuchter had been sent to Auschwitz on behalf of the defense of Zundel. He came back, testified in the courtroom that he felt that his scientific study of the Auschwitz gas chambers had shown that these could never have functioned as gas chambers, and that the ovens could never have incinerated the large number of corpses. And David Irving, who was in the courtroom when Leuchter said that, endorsed publicly Leuchter's position that Auschwitz was a lie and the Holocaust as a result a hoax. He became the publisher then of the Leuchter report and also its main propagandist. And we see here then the version that he published was also a foreword. Focal Point Publications is his own publishing imprint. And this was seen by many Holocaust deniers as a breakthrough, because Irving had a reputation to lose as a writer of World War II histories. It was that very reputation of Irving that he in some way handed over to deniers who had never been able to get the historian to endorse their position, that alarmed many people in the community of historians, also in the Jewish community. And Deborah Lipset, a professor of history at Emory University, then wrote a book denying the Holocaust, a growing assault on truth. That basically she identified him as a very dangerous Holocaust denier because he had a reputation, called him a falsifier of history, an anti-Semite, a Holocaust denier, and so on. And as a result of this book, regular publishers started to cancel contracts with Irving, and as a result of that, he started to basically lose money. And he then, in 1996, initiated a lawsuit for libel against Lipstadt in a British court. And in a British court in libel trials, the defendant has to basically prove that whatever he or she said is true. So the burden of defense is on the defendant. And the defense team asked me to join them because in 1996, I had co-authored a book on Auschwitz where I very much engaged with the architecture of the place, and that was exactly the stuff that Leuchter had investigated, that had been the focus of his pseudo-forensic investigation. So finally, in 1998, I start to work, and I have around a year to write a 750-page expert report that basically looks at all the evidence. You know, what kind of evidence exists? Evidence that was collected before Auschwitz was liberated, afterwards, what confessions there are, what material evidence is there in documents, and so on, and then what deniers have been doing, how they have been challenging that evidence, and then ultimately about Irving's role in all of this. So A key piece that is also going to be contested in the court is the existence of the so-called gas columns. These are contraptions that were placed inside the underground morgues when they were transformed into gas chambers that allows for the introduction of Zyklon. That is it is actually a material product. It's gypsum pellets soaked with cyanide, but even more important, it allows for the extraction of these degassing pellets after everyone has been killed. And the reason that this extraction is important is that the cyanide takes 15 minutes to kill, in this case 2,000 people in this gas chamber, but the degassing continues another 23 hours. And as long as those degassing cyanide pellets are in a room, it's difficult to clean up the room. So it is necessary to remove them, and you can do that by basically hoisting the basket with these pellets from the center of the column and then discard them on top of the roof of this gas chamber. And so here we have then a section. The problem, however, is that the existing blueprints do not show these gas columns. And this is the reason that Holocaust deniers say that there is in fact no material proof for their existence. So one of the things that I did in the trial is collect all of the possible evidence. This is, for example, a drawing made by a surviving Sonderkommando prisoner who had worked in crematorium number 3. And for example, in this drawing, you see 4 of the gas columns that have been drawn. And this was done immediately after the war, before any of the results of the investigation committee by Zane were ever published. So this was based on authentic memory. So the trial ended very badly for Irving. It ended very well for Lipstadt and her publisher Penguin Books. Auschwitz is very much at the center of the proceedings. And here we have then the day after the judgment. He says Auschwitz is a mess, but he's never set foot in the place, never seen the evidence. And some 25 pages in the court basically dealt in detail with this issue of the evidence for Auschwitz, which I then produced in this book that Liliana mentioned, The Case for Auschwitz. In 2007, a then still relatively unknown Chilean architect, Alejandro Aravena, visited School of Architecture at Waterloo. I gave him a copy of the book, and then in 2015, he contacted me again after his appointment as curator of the 2016 Venice Biennale, inviting me to create an exhibition based on the book. And so with 2 colleagues, Donald Mackay and Anne Bordeleau at the University of Waterloo, and a team of students, we developed a concept called the evidence room. An evidence room is actually a concept a room that mostly exists in police stations, where evidence that's collected on crime scenes is stored. And in this case, we were going to assemble in a single room the evidence that had been prepared for the trial. So here are the pictures of Anne Bordeleau to the left and Donald Mackay. And we had also a team of students. So the concept was very simple. The center of the room were going to be scale 1-to-1 models, so life-size models of the 3 elements that had been at the center of the proceedings in the trial. That is the gas door, the gas column, and the gas hatch, which was in some smaller crematoria a way to introduce the Zyklon into gas chambers. Then what we were going to do is on the walls present by means of casts, plaster casts, the documentary evidence that attested to the existence of these 3 pieces that we had in the center of the room, and then pull the whole thing together into a single room, into a single exhibition by creating a roof. So this was not going to be evidence in a room, but the evidence room, very much like a 16th century Wunderkammer. It was a project that very quickly we realized was going to be quite expensive. The total budget was around 320,000 euros. So it fell to me to basically raise the funds for it. And so we produced these kind of drawings as part of a fundraising brochure. The money was raised mostly in individual donations. And what was very important in our approach is that because we couldn't show the original pieces of evidence, since they are in archives in Eastern Europe, that we would be using casts. We would try to make casts of drawings, of documents, of photos, and so on. Of course, casting is a important practice in preserving evidence. In this case, the appearance of a dead person. Casting also, goes back to the 18th century, when also footprints of burglars that are found in the mud and so on, cast will be created to preserve the footprint. So in this case, we started to take blueprints. Here we have a blueprint of crematorium number 4. We see the little hatches. If you look at the elevation, the gas chambers are to the right. It's the lower annex, and there's 3 square little points there. These are these infamous gas hatches. In plan, they are actually to the left of the plan. But then we created, after much experimentation, a cast of this drawing, and this cast was going then to be displayed in the room. Very importantly, that it was going to be an object that could be touched. In fact, the idea was that in this case, touch was going to be a more important tool of actually investigating this particular piece of evidence than the eye. So here we have some pictures of the process. We have Siobhan Allman and Anna Longerich, who tried to make sense of a plan of Auschwitz-Birkenau that ultimately ends up also as a cast on the wall, and behind you see the designs for the evidence room. Student Michael Nugent, who constructed the one-to-one model of the gas column. He was a trained blacksmith, so he certainly his skills were very important in this whole project. Brad Paddock, who is a very good carpenter, also a student at our school, working on the gas door. And here we have Anna Bezukhova and Anne Longerich, who are casting again a drawing, and this was quite an adventure to try to actually to find ways how do you cast a drawing, which of course is flat, or how do you cast a photograph. So in the end of March 2016, after basically 3 months of work, we had an exhibition ready in 12 large crates. We also had a couple of crates with tools, which then were flown to Venice. And there the whole team arrived to install it, starting on April 15. And it was a 4-week process to install the room in the existing space. We had quite a steel installation to carry also all the casts. Remarkably, we had some 70 casts. All of them survived the trip intact. They were quite resilient. Again, you see here Anna Bezukhova and Michael Nugent, and then Piper Birnbaum, who was basically in charge of organizing everything. Here we have the team just after we've cleaned up the room, but this is the little camera that recorded the whole construction. And then finally, the room as it was on the day of the opening. You see the model of the gas column to the left, the gas door to the right, and between them you see the gas hatch, and then you see the casts on the wall. Just again to talk for a moment on about the gas column. There were 8 gas columns have been created, 4 for crematorium 2 and 4 for crematorium 3. And each of these gas columns killed an average of 100,000 people. So in crematorium 2 and 3 in total, 800,000 people were murdered. So certainly this is a very lethal instrument. So I'm ending here with a couple of pictures. The first one is a engraving from one of Robert Flood's treatises on the human imagination. It was a 17th century physician, and it's a beautiful image of the way the imagination basically negotiates both data obtained by our senses and also knowledge that comes from the supercelestial world. And when we basically turned on the light, when the room was finished and we finally had the lights in place, it really was for me and also for my colleagues a sense that we were actually in the brain of the architect of the gas chambers, Walter de Jaco, that there was this, there's a kind of a clarity to the situation, that it was in some way crisp, it was pristine, so that we had brought ourselves back to the moment of the invention of this most infernal of architectural realities. So I'm ending here then with the photo of the architects who conceived of this. Walter de Jaco is standing to the right of the man in the relatively light coat who stands in front of the second column from the right. That's the chief architect, Walter Karl Bischoff, and then Walter de Jaco to his right, looking away from the camera. And then finally, the cast of the photograph as it also was displayed in the evidence room. So that's my presentation. I hope that I didn't go terribly over time. I guess I did, but I hope have some time for conversation.
Thank you, Robert, for this presentation and to guide us through, let's say, the realization of the evidence room based on their historical research and the dispute and the trial, right? I would like to point out one aspect you just mentioned at the beginning of your presentation, the idea of forensic, from where it comes, forensics, right? And you're right, it's of course originally denotes forum. So I would like to read a little piece regarding that, and then I have two questions for you. So this word coming from forensics, Latin word from forensics, the word denotes forum and thus refers to the practice and ability to generate an argument in the form of a professional, political, or legal meeting. In classical rhetoric, this ability is emphasized as something of actually addressing a forum via objects. But since objects do not speak for themselves, the need for translation, mediation, or interpretation of the language of things remains. Following this, forensics reveals a relationship between the three components, an object, a mediator, and a forum. So, as you just mentioned, Thomas Keenan and Eyal Weizmann emphasize in their study on forensic aesthetics that, quote, the forum provides a technology with which claims and counterclaims can be presented and challenged in the name of the objects, end quote. Accordingly, the forum does not seem to be given as a space, but is only produced through a series of interwoven performances. So the forum does not exist before the presentation and generation of evidence. Forums are thus set up around controversial matters, precisely because they are controversial. Forensic, in that sense, according to Keenan and Weizmann, can be understood both as the archaeology of the recent past and as a projective practice that only construct new forums. And regarding that reflection to your presentation, to bring it back to your presentation, I really would like to ask you, how was with the evidence room, you created, it seems, a new forum around the controversial matter you just shown through the casted forum, through the decision to cast them and to present them in the evidence room. How this new forum worked, such as at the exhibit, at the display, as the Venice Biennale. What was your experience? What was the reaction by the public?
Now, the evidence room has been shown 3 times now in 3 different contexts. So first it was at the Biennale, and there it was created basically for the architectural profession. And the question that the evidence room posed was, one about the ethical and moral responsibility of architects, and the way that both in my fundraising for this thing that I got people to support this, and also the way we presented it in Venice itself. And I just want to go back. Already when you have to raise funds, you basically are already in some way in a presentation. It's not simply that this thing comes ready-made from the sky. And the way that we were addressed it was, what is the greatest crime an architect has ever committed? And the idea was, where is actually the professional responsibility of architects? How do architects today understand their own professional responsibility? By looking at the worst case scenario, that is an architect who designs a genocidal tool. That in generally was picked up nicely in the various reviews that we got. New York Times spent an article on this, a number of architectural journals. But in the case also of Venice, we got criticism, and the most important criticism was about the aesthetics. That is the fact that we had created a beautiful piece about a very ugly reality. And so the question is, how do you justify such a beautiful room? Because it actually is a beautiful room. I mean, it's a nice place to be in. It's very pristine. How do you justify it? So basically, we dealt with the morality of a profession that is completely devoted in some way to an aesthetically pleasing result, and we were challenged on the aesthetics of this. This challenge didn't happen in the second or third exhibition. The second exhibition was for a year and a half in the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, which is the largest museum in Canada. And in this case, it was in a survivor community. Toronto is one of the largest Holocaust survivor and Auschwitz survivor communities in the world, apart from Tel Aviv or New York. And there, in some way, the place became a setting for survivors to tell their story. So this was very different. We didn't have any Holocaust survivors in Venice. And so this was, I would go, I almost live next to the museum. I would go there often. And so quite often you saw there a transference of basically information of knowledge from an old person to a school class or so. So this was very much witnessing the witnesses. That is a concept in Holocaust education, especially as the last Holocaust survivors are right now at an age that they die. In the Hirshhorn Museum in Washington, D.C., a modern art museum that is part of the Smithsonian Institution, we exhibited right at the middle at the time when the crisis at the Mexican-U.S. border escalated. And it was a much shorter exhibition. But what was interesting is that the conditions in the refugee or the asylum seeker in pens, their prison pens, their camps where they were put, which at that time were being inspected by Vice President Pence, and what was shown in the evidence room was directly connected by a number of people, inclusive a journalist who wrote a major article in the Washington Post, and who said, this room bears witness to a crime that happened 80 years ago. What will bear witness to the crimes that the government is conducting right now in relationship to asylum seekers? So we got very different responses in each of these different settings. And so the evidence room in some way seems to be a character when it comes to a particular place that takes on another role in that society.
Thank you, Robert. Yeah, so this is what I've perceived as well, that let's say the different forums you created through the different settings of cause different reactions. And just what you mentioned, that we are in the temporality of witnessing the witness and to establish a testimony as such through the oral material witnessing. I would like to bring in here the idea what Susan Shipley, artist and researcher Susan Shipley, just recently discusses regarding the evidential role of matter with her book Material Witness. So when media records trace evidence of violence, this is also in other contexts, just transitional contexts for the Kosovo, Japan, Vietnam, or also in Latin America. So to do so, she introduces a new operative concept, which is material witness, which is an exploration of the evidential role of matter as both registering external events and exposing the practices and procedure that enable matter to be a witness, she writes. So looking at the way in which materials become contested agents of dispute around which stakeholders gather, right? And the evidence room makes it pretty clear. So you have the gas column as a disputed matter. You cast it, recast it as, you reenact it in this sense. So my question now is this rearrangement of disputed matter, yeah, which you have done somehow with the evidence room, exposes at the end the contingency of witnessing and raises the question, about what can be known in relationship to what we see or what we can see or what is sensed, and what is able to, in that sense, to bestow meaning onto things, as the gas chamber door from the inside split it from the view from the victims and view from the perpetrators. Could you help us understand your use of witnessing or material witness that I very much see in your intervention with the evidence room?
Yeah, so I thank you for the reference to Susan Shopley's work. She is, of course, a major name in this whole field. Has worked, I think, for more than 2 decades. Also, it was A.L. Weitzman has been central to that operation. I also would like to first mention the name of Laura Levitt, who's a professor at Temple University in the United States, in Philadelphia, who recently published a book, The Objects That Remain. And she ends with the evidence room, but her book is actually generated by a sexual assault that she suffered 2 decades ago. And she's very open about it, and hence I feel that I can mention it also. It is the trigger for the book, and in which at a certain moment pieces of underwear become evidence. And so she is fascinated and of course traumatized also by basically the use, in this case, of garments, of her own garments, in this whole in the judicial proceedings that follow. I think that in both cases that having been in under cross-examination in a British court which works under the common law system, we know, of course, that a witness, to be in the position of a witness is an awful position to be in, because certainly in the common law system, the other side will try to destroy you. I mean, the only way that quite often the advocate, the lawyer for a criminal, can actually get the criminal off is by actually destroying the credibility of the witness. This means that the witness, first of all, quite often is going to be a person who already was in some way victimized. I mean, a person who was in a weaker position in the engagement than the victimizer was, and then on top of that is going to be punished in court. Yeah, and it is rarely that actually a witness of who is also a victim can actually stand up to that battering. Yeah, and it's in that case, of course, that the objects become very important. The objects at a certain moment have a finality to them, and also the expert witness is not going to be emotionally involved mostly in the thing. The expert witness can come with his or her authority and then start, this incredible associates are more certain in their position. They can actually push the argument under cross-examination much more, I would say, in a much more credible way than the ordinary witness who is exposed to this assault by the lawyers. When we created the evidence room, we very clearly did not want to make the argument that the material evidence by itself says anything. Yeah. What we wanted, the way we used it, is that the material evidence supports in conjunction with an argument made by an expert witness, the testimony of the material witnesses. That means the testimony of the survivors. This was also the way that I argued in the court itself and in my expert report. That is, that if you are going to say that the whole issue can be in some way decided on the basis of material evidence alone, then you're in some way buying into the argument of Holocaust deniers, who say all the material witnesses are either confused or they are lying, so you shouldn't take any credence of what they say, and only the material evidence can in some way settle the issue. And then we have two competing experts. Experts of the deniers say one thing, experts of the quote unquote exterminationists say something different. And so my role in the court and later in the evidence room was to basically diffuse that argument. And so one of the things that we have in the evidence room, we have casts of actually the portraits of the witnesses. Yeah. So a very important witness was Henrik Tauber. And Henrik Tauber, we have a portrait of him. So how the gas chamber have all the documents that support his testimony. So in my presentation of the evidence room, I always would first go to Henrik Tauber, and then I say, Henrik Tauber gives this description of the gas column, there you have this column, there you have the description, there you have the drawings, the relevant drawings, always coming back to the witness. So that I think is very important, because our tendency, of course, is especially now also because the witnesses cannot be interrogated anymore, to say, okay, most of them have died. Tauber has died into the year 2000. To say, as we cannot cross-examine them anymore, their testimony is now less relevant. So I'm very much focused on the witness as the key agent here, more important than the expert witness.
Thank you. This is also what underlined both Thomas Kennan and A.L.'s Weizmann. They said that if the victims are absent and they're becoming more absent, and no witness appears, then testimony in the usual sense cannot take place. Right. And this is, let's say, also identifying a bit the forensic turn, which defines the legal setting in a different way, right? So
and in a genocide, of course, the genocide is of course tries to come to a situation where there are no witnesses.
Absolutely.
And the gas chamber itself. This is Holocaust deniers made the argument, we are willing to basically listen to the testimony of somebody who witnessed the murder in a gas chamber, but you cannot. It's impossible. You cannot be in the chamber being a witness and not being killed yourself. This is one of the reasons that gas chambers take a special place, I think, as a tool of murder in the history of humankind.
I've just seen that we have a question from the public. I would like to read it. What would you say are the motivations behind the Holocaust denial, especially in the case you testified in?
Now, when you we basically had to put Irving on trial because that's the way you defend in a libel case. You in some way, while Lipstadt was formally on trial, you basically prosecute Irving in a sense as your means to defend her. And then you have to establish motivation. And the motivation, as our team established it and which convinced the court, was anti-Semitism. So basically, the argument goes that anti-Semites believe that Jews are cheats. That they for years have that they are very powerful. That's a conspiracy of Jews, and that they're swindlers. And so here, Holocaust denial, the Holocaust is the result of a worldwide conspiracy of Jews who control the media. Hence, they control the narrative about the Second World War to swindle the Germans out of billions of Deutschmarks and the Palestinians out of a homeland. That argument goes to the core of basically the anti-Semitic trope of Jews as being both powerful and swindlers. So it's very clear to me that is the simplest explanation. And then other things might be added to it.
So are there more questions from the audience? So you're still invited to participate in this conversation. Yeah. I would maybe like to bring in a figure from rhetoric to describe a bit the function of how we deal with testimonies or witnessing, right? This is the figure of prosopopeia, which is, it denotes the inanimate speech to the expert businesses, right? Through an artificially giving voice instead of the absent or missing person. And this over juxtaposed with the idea which is formulated in the international law, such as regarding enforced disappearance, refers to the fact that the person has been kidnapped or imprisoned by a state or its representatives, followed by a refusal to acknowledge the deprivation of liberty or by concealment of the fate or whereabouts of the disappeared person, which place such a person outside of the protection of law. And I just feel that here is a similar shift that we have, that the absence materially, but also the absence of witnessing creates an absence in terms of formulating an argument towards evidence. Maybe you can help us to understand a bit how you did this as a historian, but also how you intervened into that absence with the evidence room.
Yeah, the absence of evidence at times becomes evidence. That is that in legal systems, of course, there is an obligation of in any state that is ruled by law of the authorities when they've arrested somebody, when they hold somebody, is to produce a person in court. Yeah, habeas corpus. Yeah, we are holding this person. And this person is going to be shown in court in front of society, represented by a jury or a judge, or so to speak. And then at that moment, also the state takes responsibility for it. Yeah. So the problem, of course, is what happens when that doesn't occur, which of course is what also the concentration camps were. In the German concentration camps, there was absolutely no legal decision to put somebody there. There was also no judicial oversight. There was no presentation in a courtroom. People disappeared into the system, and most of them never came out of it. In the evidence room, our technique of, and especially as developed by Anne Bordelot, of using actually plaster, in some way had to address that, because the plaster cast, the casting itself is always making in some way something that is absent present. Yeah, it is basically a trace of something that isn't there anymore. That is the mold that from which the cast was taken. And we were quite explicit in our presentation and the way that we talked about it, that it's not simply that casting is traditionally an important kind of technique of preserving information in the forensic trade, but also that it in itself, and of course most famously in the case of those people and animals who died during the Pompeii in Pompeii 2,000 years ago, where their bodies ultimately created these voids under the earth, which in the 19th century were filled with plaster, and then are now on display. Basically, the absent bodies are on display in Pompeii itself and in Naples. So that was, I think, in the choice of materials very clearly, and in the choice of our technique also, that we always said that the plaster itself screamed the absence of the original piece, but also at the same time also justified it, because we couldn't get the originals. I mean, we had no access to them. Yeah, I mean, they were locked up in professionally run archives. I guess that would be the most simple and most kind of material way that I could answer you.
Thanks, Robert. I would like to continue that idea because I'm really intrigued by the evidence room, how as an architectural intervention or an aesthetic intervention, so to speak, it really visibilized the limits of jurisdiction or justice, so to speak, in terms of the absentees, either of material witnesses or persons who could testify, but they are murdered and do not exist. Can you again help us understand, or if you have reflected about the idea that architecture, arts, or other aesthetic practices really could fill in the gap of what justice cannot do, or law, when law cannot do justice, and what is the relationship between, for you, through the aesthetics and architecture, with law and the limits of law to do to speak justice and to find truth?
I think that I think maybe the way that you asked the question, I probably cannot give a satisfactory answer to you. I guess you have a good answer in your mind. But what I can say is, and something that we that was actually didn't come from us, but it came from an observer who's a very wise man, Beryl Lang, in the United States, has written a lot on the Holocaust with a philosophical angle. And when he saw the evidence room, he said, this actually is quite a remarkable piece of work. He said it actually creates history. And so why would it create history? We never set out to create history. He said, throughout history, people have created monuments to their heroes, even if their heroes are criminals to other people. The people who create a monument believe that the person on the horse or whatever like that who is depicted is actually their hero. Then for much more recent vintage are the memorials to victims. And it's really a 20th century phenomenon. And that comes as a result of the great genocides and massacres and human rights violations. And he said, but what you seem to have done, you plural, that is our team, is actually have created a memorial to the perpetrators. And he said that never happens, that people go out of their way to create a memorial to the perpetrator, not as a hero, because these perpetrators would have been heroes for Germans if the history had ended differently, but as criminals, as criminals who deserve in some way, whom we try to represent, not in their not as people who are possessed by the devil, possessed by evil, but actually as these incredible professional, inventive people, And when I say that the evidence room celebrates in a very paradoxical way the moment of invention of the gas chambers. What we do is that we actually, in some way, I think, question actually the whole problem of perpetrator, of who the perpetrator is. I mean, the big problem that we have in persecuting genocides is that we're walking, and this was very clear in the Auschwitz trial held in Frankfurt in the 1970s, that we were still working with this idea that an individual is liable, criminally liable as an individual. This is central to all jurisdictions. But in genocide, it doesn't work anymore. That's the problem. In genocide, at a certain moment, when the state becomes an actor, a major agent in the creation of genocide, then in some way you can get the answer from, I just was following orders. Where is the responsibility? In the case of Eichmann, he was arguing that he just was putting people on the train. that was everything he did. He was just a transportation guy. And now we know that, of course, that was a lie. There was more to it. But today in Germany, very importantly, just having been in a concentration camp where murders were happening, in this case, there's a trial going on a guard in Sachsenhausen who's 101 years old, that is enough to be criminally liable for what happened there. One doesn't need anymore to show that this person individually, as an individual, created this crime or that crime. Just that person's presence is enough to make, basically, to earn this person a conviction. And I think that is something that the evidence room, I think, can help with, to make that very clear by putting, in this case, the designers central, who never threw gas in this room, who never closed the door, who never turned the switch, and in some way to celebrate their invention. To in some way say, these people created something new in the world, and mostly we celebrate when people create something new in the world. We call that creativity. They were very creative people. De Jaco was a very creative man, and to then say, okay, but this is a fundamentally evil place, but we're not going to make it ugly or anything like that. We allow that moment of illumination to be there in its full abstract original glory as he experienced it. I think that we in some way can help to support this argument that in the case of genocides, the traditional notions of individual culpability do not apply anymore, and that we all share certainly a political one, but even we might, by just being there, also share in a criminal culpability if a genocide occurs. And that, I think, would be, in this case, I think that the evidence room supports that argument.
Thank you. This is also what I have read from the evidence room. So I got this idea as well. So it's, so I think we are running out of time. Robert, if you wanted to share with us some pictures of the installation of the evidence room, or is the
we've seen it. You've seen it.
Okay, perfect. Perfect. I thank you very much for this talk, and also to sharing with us these images, especially on the installation and the making or the genesis of this evidence room. I thank also the audience for listening to our conversation, to the talk to Robert. And I thank very much for Traces for organizing this event tonight.
Thanks a lot, and be safe. And I hope that you have happy holidays.
The same. Happy holidays.
Okay.
Thank you. Bye-bye.